Welcome to another episode of Raising Them Up,
our Christian parenting Q&A podcast, and we're your hosts.
I'm Israel Wayne.
And I'm Brook Wayne.
Welcome to the Raising Them Up Parenting Q&A podcast, where we tackle some of your parenting questions. We have some great ones lined up for this week. But first, we want to invite you to be able to submit your own questions, and you can do that at the website for this podcast, which is raisingthemup.org. You can also email your question to raisingthemup@generations.org, or you can call a toll-free number and leave a voicemail, which is 1-800-223-6567, 1-800-223-6567. And our first question that has been submitted by a listener this week is...
So the first question is, how do you determine whether or not to allow your teens to go on mission trips outside of the country? And the concern is mostly safety, but could you speak to other issues as well?
Yeah, well, there certainly are a lot of issues. And first thing I'll speak on is the aspect of motivation and what the purpose is for the missions trip. So the first thing that I'll say is I think a lot of young people just want to go have an experience.
Right.
And for them, they wouldn't care if it's Six Flags or camp or missions or whatever. It's just a way to get out of the house, kind of get away from the parents for a while, go have some adventures, right? So for a lot of teenagers, that's their motivation. I would say a short-term missions trip overseas is usually a very expensive way to accommodate that. There sometimes can be much more affordable and sometimes more profitable ways for them to spend their time than in a short-term missions trip. There are so many factors, so many considerations. I think the first thing from a service standpoint is to evaluate the heart of this young person and really, do they serve in the context in which they're currently placed? And from my own experience as a teenager, I had this dynamic where there was an invitation for young people from our church to go on a short-term missions trip, very expensive. I think even back then it was a couple $1,000s. And so I went to my mother, and we didn't have that kind of money. I had a single-parent mother, and it was really not realistic for me to be asking about trying to, her to pay for something like that. But, I remember telling her, I just really feel this burden to go help on this missions trip. And I was in that category of teens who just kind of wanted out of the house to go do something. But one of the things that she kind of called me out on was the fact that I wasn't really pulling my weight in any substantive sense in terms of helping the family. I wasn't keeping my room clean. I wasn't keeping up with my homeschool studies very well. I was reluctant, to do anything that I was asked to do around the house. I wasn't volunteering to serve in any meaningful capacity in my local church. And so my mom said, I think it's ironic that when somebody asks you to serve here, you're very reluctant and you're just not into it. But all of a sudden, you have this burden to go serve people across the world that you don't know and that you've never met. And she explained how service is something that really is supposed to be an outgrowth of our own heart and our own service local. Like Jesus said, when he was talking to the disciples, that you would be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and the uttermost parts of the earth. If we think of that in concentric circles, your Jerusalem is the thing that's closest to you. So that's probably your family. Your Judea may be your local church. Samaria might be your local community. And then the uttermost parts of the world kind of out from there. And so I think that's something to encourage our teenagers to consider is, have they really been serving in a local capacity? If they have, and everything's great on that front, and there's no hypocrisy in it, then I think you can start thinking about going on a short-term mission trip. And so from a cost standpoint, having teenagers go do unskilled labor at that kind of expense is not the most efficient way to actually do the work that needs to get done. And I can already hear people yelling at me through the microphone here. They're saying, yes, but the experience is not about the people that they impact or the boots on the ground in that country.
Right.
It's about what it does in the heart of the young person, helping them to have a cultural experience, seeing what God's doing on the other side of the world, especially if it's a third world country, seeing that not everyone lives with the kind of luxuries that they do. And so oftentimes it can really light a fire under that young person for service, for maybe full-time missions, etc. And I'm going to grant that. I think that's true. And that has been a major reason why we have wanted to encourage some of our young people to go and do that kind of mission work, even though from my standpoint, I look at it and say, boy, this could be done a whole lot faster and easier, way more better financial stewardship. If they're just sending the funds as opposed to going for a week. But there is something about young people who sometimes need the experience, and it really can be life-changing. So I think that's something as a parent that you have to pray about. When we start talking about one more thing on that. One thing that I do think is helpful is there are times where someone does develop some skill or expertise.
Right.
So our oldest son, for example, works as an assistant to an eye surgeon. He's what they call a scrub tech. And he actually had the opportunity to go to Jamaica last year and to do something like 40 plus cataract surgeries, which is life-changing for those people, and to be able to share the gospel as part of that medical missions trip. That's a whole nother level. That's a skilled level caliber where they just don't have skilled people. They don't have the kind of equipment to be able to do those surgeries in some of these rural areas. And so we strongly encouraged him to go.
And we just asked a lot of questions. In that particular case, I think there was a major backlog with a new doctor coming in who would be there on a long-term basis. And then this missions trip was meant to just help meet and service some of the largest needs there, the most emergent needs there. So that was one of those areas where we were like, oh, yes, that sounds like a really needed aspect to go and serve in missions.
Yeah, for sure.
And a lot of interaction, too, with folks. It wasn't just doing something behind the scenes. So
pushing a wheelbarrow.
Right, which, of course, has benefit. And I would say even on that issue with Ecuador, that missions trip, that was a scenario where we asked a lot of questions, and there wasn't necessarily a push and play where you could have someone from the local area be hired in easily or safely. There was some trouble there.
So I think in terms of the safety issue, there definitely are considerations there that you need to weigh the cost. I remember a story that has been published in a book by Christian Aid Ministries, CAM in Ohio, and it was about those missionaries who had gone there to work in Haiti and were kidnapped, and they were held for ransom for seemed like 2 or 3 weeks. And the parents, I think, have to weigh the cost of that ahead of time. I think they really have to ask, if my son or daughter goes on this missions trip and they die in a plane crash, or their boat sinks, or they get kidnapped and killed or something, or they pick up some kind of a disease and die of that, or have health issues for years as a result of getting some kind of an infection or virus or something like that. Are we okay with that?
Yeah.
And will we recognize that this is part of the risk that's inherent in mission work? And I would say, you have to weigh that, and your son or daughter needs to weigh that, and you need to pray about it together as a family. God certainly doesn't promise us safety and protection in this life, that nothing bad will happen to us. Bad things sometimes happen to God's people. And so there's not a yes or no binary right or wrong answer on this question. There's just considerations. But I think there's a lot of research you can do about the agency or the missions organization that they're thinking of going with, what kind of experience they have, what kind of safety protocols they put in place, do some research on the cultural situation in that country. Is there a lot of violence? Are there cartels? If it's an Islamic country, what are the risks? I think you do a lot of research. And at the end of the day, if you believe God has given you a green light to go, you have to entrust your young person into the hands of God. And even if the worst case scenario happens, that this is all part of God's plan in ways that maybe we don't understand. So sorry I can't give you here's the right answer on this, but there's a lot of considerations And those are things that I think you need to pray about. Okay, and our next question for the podcast is...
So a mom wrote and said, my 14, almost 15-year-old daughter lately has been sad and depressed. She is tired all the time, constantly nauseous from worry, and I can just tell she's overall not happy. Advice.
Well, 14 is a very difficult age for anyone. I think for students, especially who attend school, there is a tremendous amount of pressure for them to fit in and to conform. There is a lot of social anxiety that they experience. There's also a lot of social anxiety that young people experience from engaging in social media. Sometimes young people are cyberbullied. There are comparison games that young people play where they feel like they don't quite measure up to their idols or their heroes that they fantasize about, or even just their friends who seem to have a perfect life on social media. So the comparison game is really bad, I think, especially for students who attend school or are involved in social media at those ages. But even for homeschool students, it can be the same thing if they're in co-op or church, or they can just have these feelings of inferiority, questioning themselves, not knowing who they are. Obviously, lots of hormonal issues, and so things are changing in your body, and you don't quite understand, just why do I feel the way that I do? A lot of things that adults would experience and have some history to know that, this will pass. This is, a bad thing in the moment, but 2 weeks from now, I'm not going to remember it. Teenagers don't have that kind of a reference point. And so everything feels like a crisis to them. They feel like things are crashing down on them if they fail in some way, if their parents are grinding down on them. They don't feel like they can understand their school studies. Whatever the issue is, there's just a lot that happens. And so I would say that depression is something that is very common for teenagers, but I would also say you really need to watch it because suicide rates are extremely high for teenagers. And I think we're living in an era where they're some of the highest in the history of the United States, that this generation struggles. And a lot of that has to do with identity, particularly those who struggle with their sexuality. And so many do. Particularly, again, those who are being fed the Hollywood, music industry, social media, public school diet of gender dysphoria. They're struggling with even knowing who they are in their own person. And so one book that I would recommend that you get and have your teenagers read, every Christian teenager needs to read this book, is called Who Am I? Solving the Identity Puzzle by Martin Iles, who is a lawyer, at least he was, and is a kind of Christian evangelist and social commentator, podcaster, blogger, influencer. Martin Iles, he was for a time the CEO at Answers in Genesis. And so I would say definitely consider having your young person talk to a biblical counselor. Have them talk with your church elders. If your church elders feel like we're not capable of handling this, then a certified biblical counselor from an organization like ACBC, they would be a good one. And, look for certified biblical counseling. Some of the Christian counseling organizations, aren't as biblically based or biblically grounded, but ACBC is a good group to look at. They have a counselor finder on their website. You can go to biblicalcounseling.com. Biblicalcounseling.com is a great place to go, and they have a counselor finder there. I would say give that a start, look and see if it's something that's gone on for more than a few weeks, then it's definitely time to start looking for help from people who are trained in knowing how to approach the issue of depression from a biblical framework.
And then I would encourage parents, obviously, to be praying through, are there any causes to this, or, any ways that you can delve into some conversations and ask, more what's going on. Of course, sometimes that doesn't help our young people want to open up when parents are so inquisitive and drilling in. And a young person maybe has no reason necessarily for why they're feeling that way. I was talking with a young mom this weekend whose children are just starting to enter the teenage years. And I told her, one thing to watch out for is as our young people who have maybe been very joyous and content in their childhood years, as they reach those older years, sometimes there's some moodiness that happens as they become a little more discontent with what's, just living within the family. And I said, it's not all bad. Some of that feeling is equipping them to ask questions, to be able to find out what does God have for them to do. And again, I think that book's really good. Who am I? Because everyone has a sense of, I'm supposed to do something with my life. And that discontent we see sometimes within the teenage years, like I said, it is not like the right timing for them to launch, obviously. But as parents, we need to be learning this is a season for helping them equip for their future, to find out what God has for them, that God has something special for them to be doing, for them to be. And we're just working with that discontent a little bit to understand it's a stage that they're starting to become aware that they're not going to be living with your family forever, probably. And that there's a world out there that needs the gospel, that needs to see the Lord's salvation. And additionally, just looking into making sure that the health issues are all in order. A lot of times these young people are going through such growth stages, even for young ladies internally, just a lot of developmental changes. And looking into supplementing with vitamins, good nutrition, helping our children if they've developed the American standard diet, that they're learning how to eat healthier foods that will equip them for their adulthood.
Charles Spurgeon, the British preacher in England, he went through long bouts of depression, some so debilitating he wasn't even able to preach on Sundays. And so it's helpful for us to realize that men and women of God who are powerfully used of the Lord experience this. David Brainerd, the missionary, and others. So having a biblical theology of the issue is very helpful as well.
And one final note, my mom always would say that when you are in a service mode, it helps take your mind off of yourself. And so I would always encourage parents with young people, be looking for ways to encourage your young people in acts of service within the community, the church community especially, and then abroad as the occasion arises. Because I think that really does help a young person realize life is not all about me, and to be able to get their focus on looking to God to supply the needed encouragement and challenge and work that they need to go forward.
And our final question for this podcast is?
So it says, our family is visiting a church of around 100 people. There's a family that attends. We aren't sure if they are members, but they have been attending for a couple of years and are professing believers. The father/husband does not attend and is somewhat out of the picture. They have teenage daughters that dress extremely immodestly for Sunday morning worship. Undergarments are visible because of the shortness of the dresses. This is a weekly occurrence. Our children are young, but they are noticing. Our question is, how should the situation be handled? Would you go to the elders? Would you say nothing?
Well, that's a tough situation. Yeah. I think that there's a couple of questions that I would ask in my mind, and this is difficult when you're the visitor, right? But the first question I would wonder is, does the church have a biblical theology of modesty? And that's a very tricky thing for church leadership to navigate, particularly if someone is visiting and they're unchurched. Or a situation like this where it sounds like the father is not a believer, isn't really plugged into the family, is not discipling his own family. And so they don't know, right? Because they haven't been taught. So, the church doesn't want to drive this family out of the church by meeting them at the door with a set of dress codes and standards.
Right.
So it's very understandable that the church may be hesitant, particularly if they are also somewhat exploring. But it said they've been there for how long?
It sounds like a couple years.
A couple of years. This family's been there. That's long enough that the wives of the elders probably could have had a conversation with the mom and to talk with her about the way the daughters are dressing. It sounds to me like the mom is attending the church.
Right.
And so what I would say is I would probably encourage you to have a conversation with the elders of the church, express concern that this is something that your children are struggling with and that is being distracting for them during the church worship time, and ask them their viewpoint on it, and if it's something that they feel is important to address or to speak about, and if they have addressed it, what the situation is. If they've never addressed it, don't intend to address it, just ask questions, not in an accusative way, but in a fact-seeking way. If their view is, we don't really have a problem with it, we're fine with it, that might not be the best church for your family, because there may be other things that they will just fail to address as well, including flagrant sin issues, right? If the goal is we just keep people here at all costs and we never confront anything in the church, that's probably a sign of weak leadership, and it's going to express itself in other ways. So, I'm never big on like stomping out of a church mat over one issue, but it can be an indication that the leadership just doesn't want to be confrontive about serious issues. So I think there's a balance there. There definitely are people who come to church who have not been taught just basic, decent standards of modesty. And this is where church leaders need to find a way to gently deal with this. And I believe it's always best for women to speak to women about these issues. And you've had to do that, Brooke, in church contexts, lovingly take a sister in the Lord aside and to say, hey, here's some things to consider about the way that you're dressing or your daughters are dressing. And maybe you could speak to some thoughts that you have just on how a situation like that could be handled, perhaps by the church leadership or... let me say this before you jump in. I have found in my experience that you going as an individual to another family in the church and trying to police their lifestyle standards, whether it's dress, entertainment, food, vaccinations, like whatever your personal preferences or convictions are, you trying to impose those upon another family, that almost always goes bad.
Yeah.
I know of almost no situations where that really works, unless you are an older, established, godly family that is looked up to by a younger, newer believer, and they kind of want your input and advice.
Right. And there's a friendship
and there's a friendship and there's a mentoring relationship. That's one thing. But you just being a family in the church trying to go to another family and say, hey, we have a problem with what your family's doing, that is almost never going to be received well.
Yeah.
And so you can't anticipate that that's going to blow up. May create a huge schism in the church even with you trying to do that. So my personal recommendation for you is not to take that path. I would say go to the elders and talk to them and wait for feedback and kind of make decisions based on what kind of feedback they give you.
Well, I think part of the issue that gets tricky here is that I believe it was Paul was saying that, how we don't judge the world for acting in a worldly way. We try to bring the Word of God and principles from the Word of God into bearing into the life of the believers, into the body. And of course, church membership sort of answers some of this, because then there's more openness that is at least expressed initially with the membership, that
an agreement to accountability.
Yeah, there's an agreement to accountability for, I would say, most churches with church membership.
Right.
And that makes it like there's a door open there. And so as people come into our church from the world unsaved, shouldn't we realize, well, they're going to be reflecting the worldly upbringing or lifestyle that they have or are currently living? And so I think there's sometimes a tendency like that, okay, we allow for that, and we don't say, oh, you need to meet these biblical standards right off the bat just to enter. We're wanting the people to come hungry and needy, and we look to a lot of times that sort of thing will be shifted as they come to the Lord and surrender their life bit by bit. We all had that coming into, even if we were raised in Christian homes, it's a surrender of our hearts on all these issues that perhaps have gotten to where now we say, oh, we have these standards or we have these biblical principles that we guide our family with. And, it's such a tricky issue and it's such a delicate issue to talk about modesty, and especially within our church. It's just, I'm not someone else's police. The
Right.
standards I have set for our home, we have set for our home,
Right.
are not anything I'm trying to like help other people live up to.
Right.
I've had occasions where families have talked to me and asked us questions. How did we get from point A to point B? Because I did not grow up we had basic modesty in place, but it wasn't like a standard of any named sort. So that's been tricky for me to know.
I should jump in here and say that I am a lay elder in our local church.
Right.
And so there has been situations where Brooke has had to step in kind of on that capacity because as an elder, it falls to me to and the other church leadership to address the issue.
Right.
But as a man, I don't want to speak to a woman on the issue. So when Brooke has had times where she's had to talk to somebody, she's not doing it just as a woman in the church.
Yes.
She is doing so with the blessing and the commission of the church leadership to say, we really need to speak to this issue, and has always done it with another leader's wife in the church, and that kind of thing. So so there's been usually a couple of ladies that have had to go and gently and lovingly speak to the situation. But we as a family, we aren't busybodies in people's lives. We aren't there looking judgy at everybody and trying to, police what other families do. I think that's, Romans 14 and 1 Corinthians 8 pretty clearly admonish us not to be doing that we have the standards that we believe that we need to practice for our family, but we need to be really careful. We're not walking around trying to impose those things on other people. But at a church leadership level, some of those things do need to be addressed.
Right. And so the way that my friend suggested within our church how to go about it initially was we did a Bible study. We have a women's monthly Bible study, and we just laid out, here's what scriptures say about modesty, and touched into the identity portion of that.
The Apostle Paul said that our bodies don't belong to us. They belong to Christ. We have been bought with a price, therefore glorify God with our bodies. And so instead of saying, this is my body, my choice,
yes,
we need to say, no, my body belongs to the Lord Jesus Christ, and I want it to reflect Him, not some kind of a rebellion, not some kind of autonomy, not some kind of a statement. You want to reflect the glory of the Lord Jesus Christ, and you do that by respecting your body. And so these are difficult questions, difficult issues, but again, we have some resources that I think you would find helpful on our familyrenewal.org web store. We do have some great books for women that touch some of these issues, some great vetted authors that I think you'll find helpful on these topics. So visit our web store, which is familyrenewal.org/store, familyrenewal.org. That's our ministry. We'd also like to encourage you to visit the website for the producers of this show, which is generations.org. They have a lot of great content for families, family discipleship materials, homeschooling curriculum, apologetics, and much more, generations.org. And then if you're interested in booking us to speak at your church or your event, we are available through my website, which is israelwayne.com. And you can see our sessions, what we talk about, get in touch with us through there. Again, israelwayne.com. So again, until next time, we appreciate you, and we will look forward to talking with you again on the Raising Them Up podcast.
This has been a production of the Generations Media Network. For more information, go to generations.org/media.